Hi, everybody. It's great to see you virtually. Our presenters today are Maria Thomas and Alissa Freeman. They are going to be talking about the adaptations of native plants and pollinators. I'm going to mute myself now, and Maria will be taking over shortly. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So as you know, I'm Maria Thomas, and Alissa is also here. I don't know if Alissa can say hi for a second.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
So we're from the BioPark, as you know, and we're asked to give this talk originally for the Native Plant Society and their Backyard Habitat program. And we thought this would be a really nice thing to do for you all today because it's seasonally appropriate and it kind of gives you some exciting things to think about outside while you're staying at home. So as we worked on this program, we realized that this relationship between plants and their pollinators is like an intricate dance, and the needs of each. And that's why today we titled it, It Takes Two to Tango, Attraction, Deception, and Mutualism between native plants and their pollinators. So the coevolution of plants and pollinators has created both subtle and amazing adaptations in each. In our presentation, Alissa and I will talk about plant pollinator adaptations, why native plants are important to support this relationship, and some of the best native plants that attendees can select for their backyard habitats. So I'm going to start by talking about some really cool examples of unique plant adaptations. Then Alissa will discuss pollinator adaptations and specialized relationships. And then I'm going to finish up with some great native plant recommendations for backyard habitats. So to begin with plant adaptations, give me 1 second. We'll start by talking about some of the basics of plant adaptations. Many of us here are probably familiar with some of the more basic adaptations that attract pollinators. For example, the composite shape of this desert marigold here. I don't know if you can see the pointer, but bear with me as we learn new technology. It creates a landing pad for bees, butterflies, and encourages them to stick around longer, potentially collecting more pollen as they hang out. This tubular shape in the bottom corner of the Zauschneria is ideal for long tongues and the hovering habit of both hummingbirds and butterflies. And then this nice blue salvia kind of toward the center provides a little of both. It has a broad petal for landing, an elongated flower, and has nectar guides on the petals as well. The scent can be either an attractant or a repellent. Fragrant flowers will attract pollinators, while pungent leaves, like on this blue salvia, will act to repel leaf-consuming predators, as in the case of the salvia. Finally, color and patternation are more attractive to specific species of pollinators, and Alissa will get more into this a little later. So with all this in mind, I now want to demonstrate how specific adaptations can become between plants and their pollinators by looking at the relationship between the passion flower and the heliconius or longwing butterfly. The two species have evolved in such a way that the longwing is one of the primary pollinators for the passion flower. However, in the ever-efficient way of nature, the longwing caterpillar also feeds on the leaves of the passion flower vine. The passion flower is able to detect predation through chemical secretions created by the browsing caterpillars. As a response, the passion flower does several interesting things. The first line of defense is to manufacture a cyanide poison to deter leaf predation. This works for most leaf-eating predators, but the longwing has evolved so closely to the passion flower that it has adapted to this, much like monarchs have adapted to toxins present in milkweed. So the passion flower then challenges the longwing, who is earnestly searching for a place to lay its eggs, by modifying its leaf shape as a form of camouflage. If you can't identify the right leaf, you can't lay your eggs. And so this bottom image shows several examples of how the passion flower will dramatically change its leaf shape in response to caterpillar predation, which is pretty amazing. If predation is still occurring at a higher than acceptable level, the passion flower continues to adapt by modifying nectar glands present in its leaf to mimic egg-like structures. And you can see those kind of little yellow dots on that top slide of the leaf. The structures mimic heliconius eggs so well that they send a message to searching butterflies that the leaf is already taken. The heliconius, not wanting to lay their eggs in a competitive environment, see the false eggs, and they move on searching for a vacant leaf. Some passion flower will also mimic failing health by deceptively exhibiting drooping tips and leaves, and you can see that in this bottom slide. The heliconius then continues to search for a more robust specimen to lay its eggs on. And as with the salvia that I spoke about earlier, scent can also play an important role in the relationship between the passion flower and heliconius. The fragrance of the flower acts to lure the heliconius to the plant for pollination, but then the fetid smell of the leaves simultaneously deters the butterfly from laying its eggs. Additionally, the passion flower uses scent from modified nectar glands to attract predators such as ants that will clean up any remaining long-winged caterpillar or larva. And in the case of the fetid passion flower, the plant actually modifies its nectar glands, and it modifies them so far as to lure and trap unwanted insect predators in this proto-carnivorous action. And you can see on this bottom image just how much those glands are modified to do this task. Passion flower is a very extreme example of how much a plant can modify itself to both lure a specialized pollinator while avoiding excessive predation by the same species. And closer to home, Nicotiana attenuata is an example of a native plant engaged in a very similar relationship as passion flowers and longwings. This Nicotiana has become so good at modifying itself in response to pollinator pressure, I affectionately call it the Wile E. coyote tobacco, and here's why. Coyote tobacco grows in arid regions across the Southwest, and a very close relative, Nicotiana obtusifolia, is even found here in Albuquerque in close association with prehistoric petroglyphs found on the West Mesa. So the sphinx or hawk moth is one of the primary pollinators for Nicotiana, and it's active from late afternoon to early morning. So it's a typical night pollinator for a not so typical night blooming plant. As the hawk moth enters into the reproductive phase of its life cycle, they also use Nicotiana as a host plant, laying their eggs on the nicotine-rich leaves of the tobacco. The nicotine provides a chemical defense most predators, but like in the passion flower and longwing relationship, the hawk moth caterpillar, or the dreaded tobacco hornworm, as we all know it to be, has adapted to this. So the Nicotiana must develop other defensive mechanisms. As caterpillar predation increases, chemicals present in the caterpillar saliva trigger the release of a scent that attracts insects, such as this Geocorus beetle. And the Geocorus beetle then preys on both the caterpillars and its eggs. Very efficient. And finally, if herbivory continues to increase, the Nicotiana flower does a really amazing thing. The plant, over the course of a few days, will change bloom time from night to day and adjust flower length, floral scent, and nectar composition to become less appealing to hawk moths and more appealing to hummingbirds, which is, as we all know, a day active pollinator. So therefore, adapting as many desert plants do to make the best use of an unpredictable and often harsh growing season, the Nicotiana virtually changes everything about its composition to deter hawk moth predation while continuing its own reproductive advancement as efficiently as possible through the hummingbird. So a similarly interesting relationship between plants and other night pollinators is a relationship that has evolved between nectar-feeding bats and the plants they pollinate. So research indicates that because nectar-feeding bats use additional sensory cues like smell and eyesight to locate the flowers they feed on, their echolocation capacity is less than that of bats that are strictly insect feeders. In response to this, many plants that rely on bats as their primary pollinator have developed mechanisms to assist these species of bats in their search for nectar. Two examples are this sea bean vine, native to Central America, and the Zorroco or Zonca cactus, native to Ecuador and Peru. The sea bean vine actually has an upright vexillium or banner petal that you can see on this kind of black and white drawing here to viewers left. And this actually amplifies echolocation. It helps to guide the bat to both the nectar and the pollen-filled flower. So what's really cool about this is that once the bat lands and forces its head into the flower, the anthers explode, covering the bat with pollen. And then the weight of the feeding bat breaks the banner petal where it joins to the flower. And once it is done feeding and leaves, the vexillium closes after pollination, and this prevents further echolocation and nectar loss. So successfully, it accomplishes pollination while minimizing the energy spent to produce nectar in the process. So the second example of plant-assisted sonar is the Zorroco cactus. It was previously thought that the cephalia, or these adult reproductive hairs that you see kind of underneath the flower in the image to viewers' right, it was previously thought that those were present solely to protect the flower and fruit from predation. However, bat research has demonstrated that this massive cephalia also amplify echolocation signals, indicating to the bat where the flower can be found on the spine-filled cactus. And while I don't have direct research that indicates this type of sonar amplifying adaptation in our native plants that rely on bats for pollination, you can look at the characteristics of these native plants that attract bat pollinators, such as night blooming, heavily scented, these large satellite dish-shape or densely massed flowers. And you can see the similarity of the flower composition of our desert plants like agave, yucca, datura, and primrose to the echolocation amplifying modifications of plants like the sea bean and the Zorroco cactus. This relationship is particularly important to identify and support, as two of our native migratory bats, the Mexican long-tongued bat and the lesser long-nosed bat, are both critically endangered. Further complicating this is knowing that some plants like agave rely almost solely on bats as their primary pollinators. So when we're thinking about how to design our own backyard habitats, we really need to figure out how to support these types of critical relationships. And now, diving deeper into the same concept of plant-pollinator interdependency, Alissa is going to step up and talk more about pollinator adaptations and the specialized relationships that they have developed with our native plants.
Okay, go ahead and move on to the next slide. Can you hear me, Maria? Oh. Okay, so plants and pollinators have co-evolved physical characteristics that result in successful interactions. Plants benefit from attracting a particular type of pollinator, ensuring that the pollen is successfully transferred to one flower to the other, and that results in a successful reproduction of that flower. The pollinator in turn benefits from pollinating flowers by gaining access to important food resources such as pollen and nectar. And so this evolution of plant traits in response to pressure from pollinators is referred to as pollinator syndromes and results in that variation of color, shape, size to attract the most efficient pollinator for that plant. Next. Bees, for example, are generally attracted to white, yellow, blue, and purple flowers, with a preference for flowers that have a landing platform or tubular shape where they can nestle in and collect pollen. Here in New Mexico, we have over 1,000 native bee species, including species that are as small as the width of a quarter, which is approximately 1/10 of an inch. And so this large number of diversity in our bee species results in a diversity of native flowering plants. And bees are able to find these plants based on their vision, specifically how they perceive color. Next. So humans are trichromatic. We have 3 photoreceptors or cones within our eye, and we base color combinations on these 3 colors, which are red, green, and blue. And like humans, bees are also trichromatic, but they lack a red color cone. Instead, they have the ability to create color combinations from green, blue, and ultraviolet light. Flowers have adapted to create nectar bullseyes for specific pollinators such as bees that have the ability to see in the ultraviolet light spectrum. In fact, some species of sunflowers and primroses actually have nectar guides that direct pollinators right to their pollen and nectar resources to make pollination even more efficient. And although bees do not distinguish shades of red, they can, however, find a red flower if it has these ultraviolet markings. All right, next. Unlike bees, butterflies have the ability to see red. Butterflies, such as swallowtails, are able to see red because they are tetrachromatic, meaning that they have 4 photoreceptors or 4 color cones. So remember, again, we have 3. We can see red, green, and blue, and butterflies can see these 3 as well as ultraviolet light. And amazingly, there are species of butterflies that have up to 15 photoreceptors, allowing them to see colors we can't even fathom. So there is a lot of variation within the Lepidopteran family and their intensity and spectrum of their vision. Okay, next. Generally speaking, though, butterflies are attracted to bright colors, including reds, oranges, and purples. Additionally, they tend to prefer flowers that have narrow tubes and wide landing pads. And this flower structure allows butterflies to access nectar using their long proboscis or feeding tube. And to kind of better understand the difference between how bees and butterflies perceive flowers, the following images will provide a glimpse. Next. So these 3 images show how butterflies and bees visualize Mexican hat flower, or Rotibita columnifera. So as you can see, butterflies are able to perceive a little bit more of that color distinction within the flower, but both can see the nectar guides in their ultraviolet light spectrum. Okay, next. Let's not forget about hummingbirds, an important pollinator and a fan favorite. Hummingbirds are tetrachromatic as well. So again, their eyes have those 4 color cones, one of which is sensitive to ultraviolet wavelengths, as well as red, blue, and green. And although they can see a broad range of colors, they actually have heightened color sensitivity to the red and yellow range. Hummingbirds live on a nice edge due to their high energy use. So a hungry hummingbird might visit between 1,000 and 3,000 flowers a day to maintain that adequate caloric intake. And this monumental amount of nectar, or monumental amount of flower visits, means that hummingbirds are going to benefit from flowers that have high amounts of nectar resources. And flowers that contain high octane fuel are often colored in the red spectrum, thus excluding less efficient pollinators such as bees. So to a bee, a red flower is going to look similar to a green plant. And so this kind of ensures that the plant has the highest reproductive success rate. Next. So as I just mentioned, bees do lack that ability to see red. And so red flowers are going to be able to hide their nectar from robbers such as bees that can't differentiate between that red flower and the leaves. And thus it conserves that high nectar content for more efficient pollinators such as hummingbirds. Next. This exclusion of inefficient pollinators has created a mutualistic relationship between hummingbirds and the plants that they pollinate. So hummingbirds are generally going to be attracted to flowers that have a red, scarlet, orange, or kind of white coloration, as I'm sure a lot of you have experienced in your own gardens. And additionally, these flowers are generally tubular shaped with deep, hard to reach stores of nectar that can only be accessed by pollinators such as hummingbirds that can kind of dip in and get to that nectar resource. And while hummingbirds largely depend on nectar to survive, nectar actually only makes up a small portion of a bee's diet. Bees depend on pollen. Next. So pollen carries aminos, lipids, and proteins that sustain bees throughout their entire life cycle. And so native bees are typically solitary and they provision their own nests. So about 70% of our native bees are nesting underground and 30% are nesting in cavities of snags, so dead or dying trees or plant stems. And regardless of where they're nesting, they're typically creating separate brood cells. And you can kind of think of brood cells as rooms within a house. And so in each room or brood cell, the female is going to lay her egg and deliberately collect pollen rich in protein along with nectar and create this kind of little loaf. And then the egg will then emerge and the larva will consume that nectar, pupate, and then emerge as adult the following spring. And this mutualistic relationship between plants and bees has driven them to be the most efficient pollinators. Next. As I mentioned, this dependency on pollen has led them to be super efficient at pollinating, and it has resulted in the development of specialized hairs referred to as scopa. And these kind of serve as their pollen carrying apparatuses. So in most bees, the scopa or hairs are simply a dense mass of elongated, often branched hairs that are on their hind leg. There are, however, a few families of bees that actually have specialized these hairs even further. And I will talk about these on the next slide. So bees in the family Megachilid collect pollen on their abdomens and have reduced hairs on their hind legs. Megachilid bees are most commonly known as carpenter bees and leafcutter bees and are likely the occupants of the bee hotels that you have in your backyard. So these are cavity nesters. Leafcutter bees in particular are important agricultural pollinators and are often used commercially to pollinate crops such as alfalfa. In fact, they are more efficient at pollinating than honeybees. So if you see a yellow-bellied bee in your backyard, it is going to belong to this family. So that's one really good way to identify what's flying around in your backyard. Okay, next. Honeybees, bumblebees, stingless bees, and orchid bees, who are all in the family Apidae, have what are called corbicula or pollen baskets. And so the corbicula is a polished cavity surrounded by a fringe of hairs. You can see this on the right side of your screen. And this is where that bee collects little balls of pollen. And I personally like to call these the bee's knees because they actually do look like little bee knees. So that's a good distinguishing characteristic for this family. So again, if you're in your yard and you observe this, you're going to know that it belongs to the family Apidae. All right, next. Taking the relationship between bees and pollen even further, plants have developed specialized anthers. Just a little botany refresher, anthers are the male reproductive part of the flower that carries the pollen. And approximately 9% of flowers have these specialized anthers, referred to as poricidal anthers, and they're sealed except for a small pore at the top or side, which keeps the pollen tightly packed inside them. So these slits are small enough that insects can't enter the anther, but they're large enough that pollen can exit. And they can only be pollinated by bees that have the ability to buzz pollinate, meaning that the bee has to intentionally go visit this flower to extract the pollen. And species that have these poricidal anthers include blazing stars, the Solanaceae family or nightshade family, as well as squash flowers. Okay, next. This type of pollination is restricted to a few native bee species, and bumblebees are actually unable, or native bee species and bumblebees, whereas honeybees are not able to buzz pollinate. And to buzz pollinate, bees unhinge their wings and vibrate rapidly, knocking pollen loose. And this video was supposed to simulate that, but I guess we're having some technical difficulties. But if you just look up, Google buzz pollination, it's really interesting. It's a really cool kind of simulation to get to see. Oh, we got the video to work. So again, yeah, they just unhinge their wings and they vibrate to knock that pollen loose, and they're basically showering in that pollen. Okay, next. Although not as efficient at pollinating as bees, tarantula hawk wasps actually play a really important role in pollinating milkweeds such as rush milkweed and broadleaf milkweed. And it may surprise you to know that adult tarantula hawks do not actually eat tarantulas. Instead, the adult females are going to paralyze these tarantulas with their powerful stingers and take them to a specially prepared burrow. There, the female is going to lay an egg on the abdomen of the tarantula and then seal up the burrow. And when the larva hatches, it burrows inside the tarantula and devours the insides, avoiding vital organs to keep the tarantula alive as long as it can until it pupates. And it later emerges as this big, beautiful blue tarantula hawk wasp that we all know and love. In the adult stage, the hawk wasps actually are nectarivores, meaning that they primarily consume nectar for their diet. And just like us, they occasionally partake in fermented fruit and will actually fly around drunk. So hopefully some of you will get to see that sight this summer. And their favorite nectar sources include milkweeds, western soapberry trees, and mesquite trees. Okay, next. As I mentioned, tarantula hawk wasps primarily consume nectar, and they actually pollinate while they're sipping on flowers. And so their long, slender legs actually slide into the grooves of milkweed flowers. And inside these grooves are sacs of pollen called pollinia, and these will stick to the legs of tarantula hawks and are carried off to pollinate the next flower. And so species of bees that have really small legs actually can't collect that pollen, which is why I wanted to highlight tarantula hawk wasps as an important pollinator, because they do a lot to pollinate our native milkweeds. Okay, next. So the world of pollinators ranges from generalists who pollinate an array of flowers to specialists who are dependent on specific plant families and sometimes even species. Next. An example of a specialized pollinator is the globe mallow bee, Didacia diminuta. So the globe mallow bee is about 7 to 9 millimeters long, and it collects pollen from its favorite plant, globe mallow. So female globe mallow bees are equipped with these long, highly plumose hairs on their hind legs, which receive and carry the large pollen grains, as you can see as these visible yellow masses on their legs, back to their nest. There, the pollen grains are combined with nectar and molded into a food source that will be consumed by their little offspring. These adorable tiny nests can actually be found thanks to these chimneys that's highlighted in that red circle that the globe mallow bees create. So it's still not known exactly why they create these little chimneys around their nest, but it's speculated that they prevent water from entering. It might possibly mark the entrance for the bee to find, and it discourages predators. So this specialized relationship between the globe mallow bee and the globe mallow species highlights the importance of globe mallow as a pollinator plant. Quite frequently at the Botanic Gardens, and specifically at Tingley Beach, we get 311 calls about weeds. And more often than not, it's people calling about globe mallow. And so by understanding these important relationships with our native plants, we can alter opinions on plants that may have a bad reputation. And this includes thistles. Next. So many pollinator species are dependent on thistles. New Mexico is home to 12 native thistle species, which are ecologically important for pollinators and herbivores. And key species are actually being destroyed due to the misidentification and people going out on hikes and seeing a thistle and ripping out what they think is an invasive, but is actually a native. And so fortunately, the Native Plant Society has created this native thistle guide that is free to download, and it helps the public identify the difference between native thistles and non-native species. And at the end of our PowerPoint, we actually have a link of references, and so we have the link to this guide if anybody is interested in learning how to identify our native thistles. Okay, next. So to drive the importance of thistles home, here in New Mexico, we have a native bumblebee, Bombus cockerellii, or cockerel's bumblebee, which has only been identified at a few high altitude localities in the White Mountains, all within an area less than 300 square miles,
giving this bee the smallest range of any bumblebee species in the world. So this bee and its limited range depends on species such as the Sacramento mountain thistle, which highlights again the importance of maintaining native thistles throughout New Mexico. Okay, next. Another family of plants that get a bad reputation are milkweeds due to their toxicity. But it's this toxicity that actually makes them an intricate piece of the puzzle in a monarch's life cycle. So monarch larvae are specialist herbivores and have been reported feeding on 27 different North American species in the milkweed family. And through feeding on these milkweeds, the larvae actually sequester toxic chemicals known as cardinalides, which makes them poisonous to potential predators. And it's that bad taste and toxicity of both the larvae and adults that are advertised by that conspicuous warning coloration that makes them so beautiful and eye-catching to us. And because monarchs are such a beloved species, many gardeners want to plant milkweeds to help create habitat, which has led to the introduction of a non-native milkweed that may potentially harm our monarchs. Okay, next. So Asclepias cursavica, or tropical milkweed, is a non-native milkweed that has exploded in popularity in response to the demand for milkweed. It's simple to propagate, it's really easy to grow, and it allows growers to rapidly produce it for a quick sale. The plant is also attractive, as everyone can see, to both humans and monarchs. And monarchs do love this invasive milkweed. In fact, under current climatic conditions, adult monarchs that have fed on this species have actually demonstrated a higher survival rate and weight due to the perfect amount of toxic compounds in this plant, which kind of border on the edge of too much. So this might sound like good news. However, with rising temperatures and a warming climate, this plant actually increases the amount of toxic chemicals it produces in response to a hotter climate, and that pushes it over the edge and makes it actually toxic to monarch caterpillar that feed on this plant. So native milkweeds, fortunately, are not impacted by climate change like this plant is. Okay, next. So with this in mind, resist the temptation to grow tropical milkweed in your garden and opt for native milkweed species. The NRCS actually has a wonderful publication listing native milkweeds with information on their growing conditions, what pollinators they attract, how to propagate them. And so we actually, again, we have the link here, but we are also going to be listing this link at the end of our presentation. So if you're interested in growing native milkweeds, we highly suggest using this as a resource. So to get more into the specifics of native plants that we recommend, Maria will be discussing some of our favorite native plants, including some that are often underrepresented. So with that, I will.
Okay, so to start, we know we're entering into a period of a hotter, drier climate in New Mexico. What you see on viewers left is images of Elephant Butte Reservoir in 1994 on the top versus 2013 on the bottom. Now we're at 2020, so quite a few years have passed, and we know that it hasn't gotten any better. And then over here on viewers right, the top graph shows average summer temperatures from 1900 to 2010. You can see that they do fluctuate, but they've been increasing steadily over the last century. And then this final image depicts the predicted climate suitability for piñon pine, which I consider to be one of our most iconic trees of the New Mexico landscape. So the far left is, the recent historic suitability and range map for piñon pine in New Mexico. The middle one is if we can really, get ourselves together and get climate change under control. This is what the predicted range will look like in 2030. And then on this far right, unfortunately, is probably more what it's going to look like by 2030. So we're really losing the area for some of these iconic plants in New Mexico. We are moving to a hotter, drier state, And, you know, what we can do is, you know, the climate's changing and it's up to either us to panic and despair, or we can decide to adapt. And so along the lines of climate resilience, we've put together a selection of native perennial shrubs, trees, and grasses that are some of our best recommendations to support pollinator and wildlife habitat in New Mexico. We picked these plants because they also are not as well known as some of the more popular pollinator plants depicted in common guides and garden catalogs that you might find. And we wanted to highlight some new and interesting plants to consider for your habitats. Additionally, the native plants that I'll talk about have several characteristics in common. They're all extremely drought tolerant and seem to be adapting well to increasing summer temperatures. Most, if not all, are useful to humans as food or medicine, or for providing a resource such as dye, fuel, or fiber. All of the plants I've experienced either growing at the Botanic Garden or growing in their natural environments, and I can talk about them from that perspective. And then most of these that we'll go over are commercially available, or you can grow them from seed with relative ease. So the first one is this Thelosperma, or green thread. It's known locally as Cota, or Navajo, or Hopi tea. It's called this because all species are known to be medicinal. The luteolin that is responsible for its medicinal action is also what gives fibers the yellow coloration when you use it as a dye. And then so this tongue-twisting petalless or rayless species is Megapotamicum, and you can find it in healthy, well-established populations in even the hottest parts of New Mexico, from the mesas around Conchas Lake to the Heat Island gravel-filled park strip in my West Mesa neighborhood, where it has naturalized quite well. It has a long bloom period, all of the Thelospermas, flowers from early summer and into fall. And Thelosperma attracts many species of native bees and is a host plant for the sulfur butterfly, which, you know, maybe that's also where the sulfur butterfly gets its beautiful yellow coloration as well. Because its rugged, adaptable nature, and because it reseeds easily and naturalizes, it's the perfect poster child for demonstrating the idea of habitat connectivity, or plant corridors that native pollinators can use to move from place to place in the surrounding landscape. And then what you see in the bottom slide is the filifolium has that really beautiful burnt orange eye. And so that's another one that you can more commonly find in our native nurseries around town. So this next one, Desert 4 o'clock, it does equally well in the natural landscape as in a xeric garden setting. We have it growing in full sun at the Botanic Garden, and it looks really good with chocolate flower kind of popping up through the leaves. And I've seen it thrive in shade of a large juniper near ABQ, New Mexico. So it's fairly versatile. Desert 4 o'clock has a very long bloom period from late spring into fall, and it's a great plant to attract night pollinators. It will also attract morning and evening foraging bees and hummingbirds as well. It works well as a companion plant and ground cover under larger plantings. It helps shade out the roots of its companions, keeping them cool. And then the tuberous taproot is also edible, and the plant is medicinal as well as being used for a dye. So very nice plant, this one. The next one I'd like to talk about is sand penstemon. You know, there's 47 species of penstemon in New Mexico alone, which is pretty amazing. The one I want to talk about, though, is this sand penstemon. It's widespread through New Mexico, and it has an exceedingly long bloom period. You can see the range map for it. It's in almost every single county throughout New Mexico. So once again, this is another one that helps with the habitat connectivity for our native migrating pollinators. I've seen this one naturalized in drought-stricken areas of eastern New Mexico, and also popping up in the most random places under the cottonwood trees in the back 40 of the Botanic Garden. Penstemon ambiguus attracts butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, and the Xerxes Society notes a wide variety of native bees. It's also a larval host for many butterflies. I've seen it sporadically available at native plant nurseries, and it is easier to seed than other penstemons, so you might give that a try as well. Get a little experimental in your backyard. So there are multiple species and subspecies of Aragonum in New Mexico, all of which support large numbers of pollinators and their allies. Buckwheat flowers tend to fade to a pink or burnt orange, so it creates year-round interest even after they've bloomed out. Sulfur flower buckwheat is the one on the top there with the bee. It's got an intense yellow palm on a mounded plant, so it's very ornamental and gorgeous. Wright's buckwheat has the silver gray leaves kind of spilling over that wall in the viewer's top right. It adds textural interest to the landscape, and I think it would look really beautiful with that desert 4 o'clock. On the bottom left is the winged buckwheat, and the seeds are both ornamental and attract birds and mammals. And I have to say, you can kind of see how they illuminate a little, and when the sun's behind them, they really can glow. So it adds a little extra interest to your landscape when you leave the seed heads. And then James's buckwheat is that bottom right, and it has a nice habit of turning a reddish color in winter. So then again, you have that nice kind of low ground cover interest throughout the year. All of the buckwheats, as well as most of the native plants I'm talking about, require excellent drainage to be happy. So that's something to consider when you're planting them in your landscape. One of the most outstanding plant families for native bees is the Dahlia genus. Dahlia gregii and frutescens are both very low growing mounding subshrubs, and they both have really nice soft ferny foliage. They look great with other desert accents like opuntia and agaves, and they're considered like zone 7 and 8, but we have both growing in south-facing beds near the Bulgarian. So it's kind of that right plant, right place idea. You know, find a nice kind of protected area and it'll do fine. The gray beauty with the blue flowers it's either a dahlia or a sorothamus, depending on if you're a lumper or a splitter. Broom dahlia is the common name, and it's the larger size cousin of these other smaller ground hugging dahlias. And this one actually can be seen just bursting with blue flowers in late summer all over the West Mesas surrounding Albuquerque. Dahlia purpurea and candida is represented by this top right photo. They're purple and white prairie clover respectively. Both have more of a garden ornamental look, but as you can see from the image, both have deep nitrogen fixing taproots, which help them survive in even the most arid environments. This one is loved by butterflies and bumblebees alike, and it does really well here in Albuquerque. And then this little kind of scruffy ground cover with the pale purple flowers toward the center of the slide is actually Dahlia scariosa, or the Albuquerque prairie clover. It's widespread throughout the Rio Grande Valley, but it is also endemic to our area. So at first glance, you may think it's a weed. Don't pull it because it's one of our unique plants to this region. And many species of native pollinators love this plant. So if you find it lurking in strange areas in your yard, just let it go. So dogbane is widespread throughout the Midwest and West, including the Rio Grande Valley where it grows along the Bosque. You can see it, in fact, just growing near the Botanic Garden. It's an excellent candidate to support habitat connectivity because it has such a wide range. However, as the name implies, dogbane gets a notorious bad reputation. Dogbane is toxic to humans and pets, but also used correctly, it's medicinal. Much like foxglove and milkweeds, dogbane manufactures cardiac glycosides, which become toxic when ingested. But also like foxglove and milkweeds, dogbane can play an important role for supporting pollinator habitat. Because it's related to milkweeds, it can potentially host queens and monarchs. And the nectar from the delicate pink tinged flowers that you see in the image is also appealing to butterflies, sphinx moths, and other small insect pollinators You can see it here in the bottom left, pictured in Colorado with the Whitemir's admiral. And then here on the bottom right is the dogbane beetle. And it's more commonly found feeding on plants east of the Rocky Mountains. However, it's adapted this really interesting way of feeding to prevent entrapment by the residue of the dogbane that it manufactures to deter pests. So the beetle actually waters as it feeds, escaping the sticky trap, and then it simultaneously cleans its feet on the plant as it dines. So it's like a little bit of a moonwalk dance that it performs as it feeds and kind of gets around this entrapment that the plant produces. Anyway, like monarchs and milkweeds, the beetle uses the toxins from the dogbane to manufacture a chemical defense against its own predators, which is that beautiful shiny iridescence that you see in the picture. So wolfberry is kind of a scrappy shrub that I've seen most often up in the mesa lands of northern New Mexico. And actually, more recently, I saw it growing near all these ruins on the White Mesa if you go out to the 550 toward San Ysidro. It's an exceptionally tough shrub throughout the Southwest, and it blooms from spring to early summer, pollinated by bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. The berries are edible and medicinal, and it's considered to be a superfruit rich in antioxidants, and like the Asian goji fruit, it is said to have cancer-fighting properties. So plant this native plant instead of introducing an exotic species like goji to your yard. So it does look a little bit scraggly in winter. Often it looks kind of dead and ratty, but it's an excellent forage and habitat plant for birds and small mammals. And it's this dense thorny habit that protects these small birds from predators like hawks and house cats. And for this reason, I would encourage you to incorporate thorny vegetation like wolfberry into your backyard habitats. It also loves disturbed soil, and it's associated with ancient Anasazi ruins. It can indicate where ruins can be found by growing in a linear fashion along buried walls. And again, there's some trails out by White Mesa that I actually just saw this past weekend, where there was some low ruin walls, probably from sheep herder camps, and the wolfberry was just lined up along the whole thing growing. So really cool to see in nature. The Mahonias are one of my favorite plants at the Botanic Garden because they're one of the earliest spring blooming plants. They provide early pollen and nectar for native bees, and they bloom in profusion of bright yellow, sweetly scented flowers. Mahonia repens is a shade-tolerant ground cover. Freemantii and Hemetocarpa can be very difficult to distinguish when the fruit is not present, although I've heard some back and forth on this as well. I think probably what we determined recently is Hemetocarpa will have longer leaf blades, and Freemantii tends to be a more rounder shape. And again, I think it's a little bit hard to distinguish these, but they both have the attribute of having edible berries that develop late in summer, and then they remain on the plant through winter. So it's a great food and forage for overwintering birds. All of the Mahonias are evergreen, and they all get a nice subtle red fall coloring. And again, they provide a nice dense protective cover for not only birds, but overwintering insects and small mammals as well. All the Mahonias are highly valued worldwide for their medicinal properties, and our native Mahonias are no exception. So again, this is one of my favorite native plants. They come in all shapes and sizes, and I would encourage you to plant them in your yard. So this next one is sumac, and we have several at the garden that I'd like to talk about. Everybody's really familiar with probably three-leaf sumac. You can find it at every nursery in town. But these three, Microphylla, Lanceolata, and Ovata, are a little bit more off the beaten path, so to speak. Microphylla is a little leaf sumac, and Ovata has this nice, big, large, round leaf that you see in the bottom slide. Both have very tart, edible berries. They're very high in vitamin C, and they provide fall and winter forage for birds. And also, it's a tasty treat for humans as well. Microphylla thrives in some of the harshest New Mexico landscapes. I've seen it hosting cardinals in eastern New Mexico in late winter as they start returning. And lanceolata has beautiful, outstanding foliage. It's that kind of top left photo that you see. It's a host for hair-streaked butterfly, and it blooms in late summer. It's highly attracted to fig beetles, and this is one of my favorite things to watch at the Botanic Garden as children and adults alike run in terror of beetles buzzing off of this plant. It's really funny. And then ovata, it's an evergreen native of California and Arizona, and it's considered marginally hardy here, like zone 8, but it thrives at the Botanic Garden, and it even survived the Great Freeze of 2011 when the wind chill and night temperatures dipped like to about 30 degrees, negative 30. So that's pretty amazing. This next one is another large shrub or medium-sized tree, and it is also considered marginally hardy here in Albuquerque, but it's doing really well at the Botanic Garden and has been for years, and it's the screwbean mesquite. The screwbean mesquite is dark brown, twisting architectural trunk, large clusters of fragrant flowers in early summer, and really cool and nutritious seed pods that adorn the tree throughout winter. Two specific adaptations of this plant are the corkscrew form of the pod, which is thought to have evolved to deter bean weevils, and the seed germinates by scarification as it passes through the digestive tract of animals that feed on the pods. So it's really evolved itself to deter one predator, but be assisted by the other, which is kind of a really cool thing. The summer flowers and peeling bark also provide nectar and nesting sites for native bees, and the mesquite is a host for swallowtails, hairstreaks, and other native butterflies. So one of our former curators at the biopark was always talking about this tree, the netleaf halfberry, and I never saw the appeal until a recent winter trip down to the Oregon mountains near Las Cruces. The netleaf hackberry, it just dominates the dry canyon landscape, and it has this beautiful gnarled dense form. It's reminiscent of an ancient bonsai tree. And so although it's considered a riparian tree, you can see it growing in some of the most harshest climates in the Southwest. And again, these little berries that you see here on the bottom right slide are edible, and both humans and birds can enjoy them alike. So if there was a native plant that I would call the Snow White of all the plants, it would be the oak tree. And this is a little corny, maybe perhaps corny. Oak is loved by all wildlife. It's a host plant for a diversity of insects and butterflies, and it provides food and shelter to many different birds and mammals. There's something for literally all creatures, great and small, in the desert on this tree. Gamble oak is deciduous, and it's a host for the hairstreak. And Gamble will hybridize freely with gray oak, which can be found in the Albuquerque foothills and as far south as the Oregon mountains. Gray oak, while not considered a threatened or endangered, is actually on the IUCN list as decreasing populations. So this is another one of our native plants that you can really support by putting in your own yard. Because it hybridizes with Gamble oak, I think what we see at lower elevations is probably gray oak, and then as you go up toward the crest, you'll start running into Gamble oak, and probably somewhere in the middle is the hybrid. Gray oak is considered evergreen. However, in colder and drier winters, it will drop a considerable amount of leaves. And I think, again, you see some of that hybridization going on when you see some that are more deciduous than others. And then escarpment live oak is actually a Texas native, but it does exceptionally well here at the Botanic Garden. You can actually see them in the Cunandetta courtyard in the front and back of the mural, if you're familiar with that area. The dense evergreen foliage also provides great winter cover for insects, birds, and other wildlife. And there is a notoriously obnoxious and very well-fed squirrel that lives in the Cunandetta courtyard and just loves this tree, makes a disaster of the leaves and the acorns every year for us. So definitely supportive of wildlife. And finally, I can't create a plant list of essential habitat plants without including native grasses. Although when pollinated, grasses provide nesting sites for native bees and year-round cover for insects, birds, and small mammals. Grasses are stunning in a landscape. They catch afternoon light, they catch winter frost, spring rain, and the sound they make when the wind blows through them and the texture they lend to the garden is essential to any natural space. A few of my favorites here are on the smaller side, the rice grass, which is the top right, the scratch grass, which is the bottom right. These have kind of these erratic yet architectural seed heads, and birds love the seeds of both of them. Scratched grass is also great for erosion control, and we use it actually in a restoration project that we're doing up near ABQ, New Mexico. On the larger side are the Indian grass, which is the top left with that nice little golden accent there, and has blue-green stems as well, which is really pretty and unique when you're designing with grasses. And then the giant saccaton, which is this big golden seed head that you see on the bottom left. I think these outshine by far the non-native and invasive pampas, ravina, and miscanthus grasses that we commonly overuse in Albuquerque landscapes. And I just, I think native grasses, they add so much to the habitat and to promote our wildlife that, why use an exotic like a miscanthus when you could use something like giant saccaton instead? So that concludes the list of native plants that I hope you will consider for attracting pollinators and wildlife into your habitats. And with all these recommendations that we've mentioned today, it's our hope you can take the information and create something amazing in your own backyard. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Alissa here to talk about what else you can do in your backyard with these habitats.
Okay, so while we are all kind of trapped in our own yards, you have lots of time to start, admiring all of the things that are flittering around in your garden. And one way that you can contribute to citizen science is by using applications such as iNaturalist, where you can actually document what you see in your garden and add those observations. And then that gets added to a list of, pollinator observations or plant observations that scientists can later use to answer broad questions. And so again, I just wanted to promote iNaturalist. It's wonderful. You essentially, even if you don't know what it is that you're taking a picture of, if you upload that picture, other naturalists can identify it for you, and then you can kind of learn a little bit more about what's in your backyard. Another great program is Nature's Notebook. This helps document plant characteristics throughout the season, and it's a great way to contribute towards research. So while we have all of this free time, I definitely would recommend checking out iNaturalist and kind of showing off what all you have in your backyard. And then, Marie, do you want to talk about the nature challenge?
No, you go ahead, sorry.
Okay, it's okay. So we have the City Nature Challenge coming up. It's a competition between cities across the globe to see which city can make the most observations of wildlife. And so this is going to be going on between April 24th and April 27th. And if you do choose to participate in this, we highly recommend, practicing social distancing, keeping yourself safe. We definitely don't want anybody to put themselves in harm's way for this event. And then this is just a list of several resources that we recommend. That Native Thistle Guide and the Native Milkweed Guide I had mentioned before. Here are the links to those. There's also a wonderful documentary called Hummingbirds and it's narrated by David Attenborough. It is on Prime Video, so if you have a subscription, now's the time to watch it because we've got nothing but time. And then below are a bunch of websites that has a lot of the information that we covered. So these are definitely worth checking out if you would like to learn more.
And then as always, you're more than welcome to contact any of us at the BioPark with all of your questions, comments, concerns, input. We love to hear from you. So please feel free to reach out to us. It's been a pleasure to give this presentation to you guys, and stay safe, be well, and we hope to see you soon.
And Maria, we have a few questions in the Q&A. First of all, thank you, and thank you, Alissa, as well.
Yeah.
I'll hand it over to Maria. Alissa answered some of the questions already. She typed in a few of the answers. If you had asked a question, and there's a few more that Maria will get to. Thank you.
Let's see. So the first one, good to thrive in the East Mountains. So yes, most of these will be fine in the East Mountains. You just want to look at your elevation, and that'll give you your hardiness zone. Some of the dahlias that I was talking about, like the fruticosa and the greggii, those might be a little more challenging out there, but then like the purple prairie clover is definitely hardy. And then most of the other perennials are fine out there.
And then I'm hopefully going to answer, does colony collapse disorder affect native bee species? I don't believe so. Native bee species typically are solitary, so they are not going to be similarly affected as honeybees, but things like pathogens and whatnot do occasionally affect native bees. The main thing that is leading to bee declines are the spread of pesticides. And I think I answered a question earlier about mosquitoes. But basically, if you use integrated pest management, you can help reduce your use of pesticides and basically lend a hand to pollinators. So hopefully that answers that question.
And then can a video of this presentation be made to the public? I think actually Estrellita is working on that today. So it was our intent with this video, with this presentation, to give a live brown bag earlier in the month. But of course, plans changed. And so this has been kind of our modification. And, depending, once we get back to normal, we may actually do another one for the public at a later time. And is that all of them? I think that's all the Q&A so far. And I'm not sure what we're supposed to do after this, because this is my first Zoom presentation ever.
I'd say we are finished for today, and I just want to thank all participants and our presenters. Thank you guys for joining us, and I hope you guys really enjoyed the presentation.